Thanks, Lee, and good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Open Classroom. If this is your first time joining us, we're delighted that you're here, and if you are coming back, welcome back. Today we have a really wonderful, timely program, Oranges and Tuna, Securing Nutrition During a Pandemic, and a fantastic speaker, one of my favorite members of faculty to collaborate with, Dr. Laura Iannotti, who's Associate Professor at the Brown School and also our Associate Dean for Public Health. Laura's career and her research is in maternal and young child nutrition and also nutrient deficiencies that are related to poverty and infectious disease. She is a world traveler who leads projects in Haiti, Ecuador, and East Africa, where she collaborates with local partners to test innovative transdisciplinary approaches to addressing malnutrition. Prior to pursuing her PhD, Laura had over a decade of experience with UN agencies and NGOs on nutrition and food security programming and policy. So this is a topic that she obviously has tremendous expertise to speak to now in a new context. So with that, I welcome my friend and colleague, Dr. Laura Iannotti.
Hey, thank you so much, Janet, and thank you, Lee. It's really nice to have this opportunity to talk to you about hunger during a pandemic. But it's wonderful to see the array of people who have joined us, the alumni, the Brown School students, prospective students, as well as community members. So I really appreciate that you showed up and turned up during your lunchtime for this lecture. So what am I going to cover in the presentation? I am going to start by just introducing you to our lab, the E3 Nutrition Lab. And then I'm going to go right to explaining the title so I can satisfy Lee and his curiosity around oranges and tuna. But this also points to other elements of the lecture that I will be discussing later on. So in the second part of the lecture, I'll talk about the problem. So how does hunger and nutrition relate to infection? I'll make this relevant, especially to COVID-19. And I'll use the Brown School sort of perspective and framework of cells to society. So I'll give you a few basics about human nutrition and the biology of nutrition and certain nutrients. I'll talk about how those nutrients can protect us from infection, but also help us recover from infection. And then I'll end that section with a discussion about nutrition disparities and who's especially vulnerable in our communities. In the third section, I'll talk about some solutions and securing nutrition during the pandemic, thinking about programs, but as well some of the actors who are engaged. And then also responding in the future. As we move forward, what are ways that we can invest in nutrition for new and emerging infectious diseases, which guaranteed are going to continue to visit our planet. And then finally conclude with perhaps something that might be more relevant for you and some suggestions for the grocery bag. So who are we? The E3 Nutrition Lab, we do research to identify interventions that promote healthy growth and development in the most vulnerable populations globally. We have the following criteria. These are our 3 E's. So we look for interventions that are economically affordable and target economic disparities and poverty as it relates to nutrition. We also design interventions that are evolutionarily appropriate. So we think about that 99.9% of hominid past that we were consuming a diet that looks so different than the one that we are currently consuming. And then finally and importantly, we look for interventions that respect healthy ecosystems, environmentally sustainable approaches to improving nutrition in vulnerable groups. We have 14 members of our lab and several faculty affiliates. We have a postdoc and a GI pediatric fellow who's just joined, doctoral students, and then MPH, MSW, and MSP students. So it's a wonderful group. Okay. Lee, let's go right to explaining the title. Why oranges and tuna? Why did I choose these 2 foods? Well, there are 3 reasons. The first is that these foods actually do contain the nutrients that can protect us from infection. And I'll give you some more details later about that. But These are nutrients like vitamin A and vitamin C and zinc. And they're actually more bioavailable. If we have one of Lee's fancy recipes and we eat these foods together, we can actually more easily absorb the zinc if we have oranges or some sort of citric acid with it. So I consciously, intentionally put those two foods together. And that relates to number 2, which is that we need a healthy, balanced diet to protect our bodies from infection. Importantly, not nutrient supplements. I have been disheartened by the news with COVID-19 and vitamin and minerals supplements disappearing off of grocery store aisles. Disheartened by that because, in fact, and I'll explain this more later, what's very important is to think about nutrients in a food and even more importantly, a diet matrix. And that's the picture that you see on the right. Food nutrients are just one part of the many compounds that are found in foods. And then the third reason is related to our E for economically affordable, and that's we need to find the foods that are affordable for vulnerable populations. Canned tuna, for example, is relatively more affordable than some of the other animal source foods that we might think about. Okay. Why nutrition security and not food security? I use nutrition security. I think it's very important because it is not just about calories. Often food security, people are talking about calories, but actually what's very important to think about are particular nutrients that are missing in the diets of especially vulnerable populations. And that's why we think about nutrition security. And that equates to, it's equal to diet quality. So don't need a PhD in nutrition. I always say this, we need moderation and variety, and that's it. This is a framework that we published a few years ago now, and it basically represents the sort of spectrum of nutrition. The lab that I direct works on undernutrition, but you can see there's a region of overlap with overnutrition that's really important, and again relates to diet quality and access to high quality foods. So you see these particular nutrients that are missing in people's diets like vitamin A, iodine, iron, and this is true for populations where there's overweight and obesity, as well as for populations where there's malnourished, undernourished individuals. The underlying determinants are similar in terms of access, consumption of processed foods, sugar sweetened beverages. And then we have those really, more distal determinants like poverty, education, and food prices. And then finally, in my introduction, I did want to make the point about global. Pandemic, by the very definition, means global. And infectious diseases, you hear this all the time, ad nauseum, don't respect borders. This is true for food systems too. Food systems, we are living in an interconnected world where food systems cut across boundaries. And we need to think about hunger locally, nationally, and globally. These are some children from our studies. No reason to have them there, just I like seeing them. Okay, so moving now into the problem and thinking about malnutrition, particularly as it relates to infection, because I think this is foremost in our minds right now and how we can protect our bodies against coronavirus and other infectious diseases. So let me start first by just defining nutrition. Nutrition is actually a process. It's the process by which an organism uses food, anything that's ingested, through digestion, absorption, transport, storage, and elimination, for normal growth, for life and functioning. This is a framework that we use in my class for nutrition. And we talk about the biology of nutrition, what's under the skin. But again, thinking in terms of that transdisciplinary cells society approach, if we understand the biology of nutrition, then we can better respond at the societal level. So let me give you a couple of examples. Storage is a really good example. There are certain nutrients that we store really well in our body. Vitamin A is a good example. So we don't need to intervene on a very frequent basis for vitamin A. In fact, globally, we supplement every 6 months for vitamin A, knowing that bodies store vitamin A in the liver for long. Intake is what we mostly focus on in terms of nutrition programming. What are the variety of foods that we want to make sure people have? Metabolism and absorption are very closely related to infection, and I'll show you that in just a minute. So if you're malnourished, you're not metabolizing nutrients in the same way. I'm sorry, if you are sick with infection, you're not metabolizing in the same way. If you have been malnourished, you're more likely to get sick. There's a correlation between the two. Okay, so again, just sort of basics of nutrition. Essential nutrients are those constituents we need to get from our environment. So somewhere along the line in evolution, our bodies decided that it would be better and more energy efficient for us to get these nutrients from our environment and then redirect energy into other systems. So for example, our brains or other parts of our functioning, our system functioning. The problem is that along the way, our environments changed and we don't always have access to those nutrients that we did in evolution. So you can see that some of the nutrients that are highlighted in red are the ones that are limiting in people's diets. So vitamin A is an example, cobalamin, which is vitamin B12, and that is provided from animal source food. So anytime the students come to me as vegan and they have neuropathy or they have problems, they say, oh, you need some vitamin B12 because it only comes from animal source foods. Choline is another example. These are nutrients that are usually found in kind of what we would call luxury foods, foods that people can't necessarily afford to buy. And that's why they tend to be limited in people's diets. Okay, so back to the food matrix. And again, I like to tell my students, it's so important. We talk about nutrients individually, but you've got to go back up to that food matrix and not use supplements unless there's a medical reason for them. As I mentioned, there are something like 26,000 different compounds in foods. We've only identified 150 of them. So we have to understand that these nutrients are packaged in a way that help us absorb the nutrient and metabolize the nutrient. So rather than going towards supplements, it's much better in terms of our biological needs to use a food-based approach. The other point that I want to make, and again, I'll get to this with nutrition and infection, but it's also possible that we can overload our bodies with nutrients. If you think about it, pathogens or viruses, coronavirus as an example, they also need nutrients. So the last thing you want to do is give your body too many of these nutrients and feed the pathogen. But there are other reasons why overdosing with nutrients can also be harmful in the body. Okay, so nutrition, how does that relate to infection? There's actually a really long history of understanding that well-nourished bodies are more protected from infection. So it dates all the way back to 1810, where we observed that lymphoid tissue atrophies when there's malnutrition. Some of you, and I know if there are any MPH students on the call, you'll know that we do a case study on scurvy and vitamin C that dates back to 1753. So we hadn't discovered vitamin C, but what they observed is that in these sailors who were out at sea for long periods of time and not eating fresh fruits and vegetables, that they were experiencing some problems with their skin and with their teeth, and eventually showed that that was related to citrus. So that dates back to 1700s. And then even predating the AIDS epidemic was a syndrome that we called nutritionally acquired immune deficiency syndrome, so NAIDS, which is really what occurs when you have malnutrition. You're more susceptible to disease. So I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail, but just to really highlight the point that nutrition contributes to different arms of our immune system. And probably we are reading about this in the news with COVID-19, that it's infecting our respiratory tract primarily, although they've recently found that it can infect our gut in the enterocyte cells of our gut. But importantly, in our respiratory tract, we have mucosal immunity, and that comes from, it's driven by vitamin A is contributing to that. But vitamin C and vitamin D, among many other nutrients, are important for those physical barriers to infection. Some of these nutrients are also active in some of our immune cells, so iron in macrophages, for example, especially in adaptive immunity. So as you read about in the news, vaccines being developed, we need to have nutrition so that our T cell response to these vaccines can happen. So that is part of our memory immunity or adaptive immunity. But then you may be also reading about antibody tests. We need nutrients to produce certain antibodies. So it's very important that people are well nourished for production of IgA, for example, or IgG. And this is the one that people are talking about with SARS-CoV-2 and COVID-19. And then finally, you may be reading about or hearing about the cytokine storm that occurs in the lungs of people, especially with severe COVID-19 disease and those who end up on ventilators. And this is an inflammatory response that's happening. So there are certain nutrients that can alleviate, that can tamp down our oxidative stress and some of that inflammatory response. And those include vitamin E and C and selenium, omega-3 fatty acids. So we also need these nutrients to sort of mediate that inflammatory response. Okay, so now I want to just talk very briefly about nutrition disparities. And this is important to think about as we move forward and we protect many people from hunger and malnutrition during this pandemic. This is a map of the world. The World Food Program puts this out every year. And it's in the countries that are in a darker shade of red are the ones that are more malnourished. And you can see that sort of corresponds with some of the countries where there's other issues of drought or conflict. And also where there's extreme vulnerabilities to a COVID-19 outbreak, where the healthcare system is not in the shape that it needs to be to respond to this infection or other infections for that matter. What the map does not show, very importantly, are disparities within countries. So there are extreme nutrition disparities that occur in different countries, including our country, but across the world too. So malnutrition affects 150 million children as manifested in stunted growth, but also in development. I really wanted to point to, again, the problem of hidden hunger, which is these limiting nutrients or these nutrients that are missing in people's diets because of poor quality. In our own city of St. Louis, we have this phenomenon, unfortunately, of food deserts. And this is where people just have limited access to these high quality foods that I keep referring to. On the left, you can see that this is a map that's generated from USDA website. And in green, these are communities that are greater than 1 mile for urban areas and 10 miles for rural from supermarkets. In yellow are communities that don't have access to vehicles to drive to supermarkets. And there's overlap in those regions. And then you can see on the right, I've downloaded a map from city and county health departments for COVID-19, where you can see there's some overlapping areas with food deserts. If you haven't visited this website, I would really recommend it. So this is produced by HCRL. It's called Focus 19, and HCRL is the Health Communications Research Lab. And they have been tracking data from 211 helpline requests. And you can see from this map that there has been this enormous increase in requests for food assistance. People are hungry. And the front page of the New York Times today, they featured hunger in America. and a Brookings Institute report that showed that nearly 1/5 of mothers with young children are reporting that they're not getting enough food. This is 3 times as high as the financial crisis that occurred in 2008. So people are hungry and they're not getting the food that they need. And then you may also be reading about disruptions in the food system. Again, thinking in terms of this interconnected world we live in. There are these outbreaks that are occurring in meat and poultry processing facilities close to home in St. Joe, Missouri, where they had 373 cases. And this is disrupting production of food. But we also have some vulnerabilities that I want to point to within our food system. So people who have been deemed essential workers that are being put at risk in order to feed the rest of us. And I want to point to this vulnerability and just say, do your best to try to protect them and try to spread the word that we protect them. So grocery store clerks or migrant workers, but those across the entire food system. Okay, so before I move into a few slides in the solution section, I just wanted to mention nutrition within the life cycle. And the reason I'm mentioning this or talking about this is because, again, as we think about programming for nutrition, who are the people that we want to target within our households, within nutrition programs? Who are the most vulnerable nutritionally? What are the implications of malnutrition within different periods of the life cycle? My research focuses on maternal and young child nutrition. So during pregnancy and lactation and then through 2 years of life, we have a very vulnerable period where there are nutritional insults that result in stunted growth and development over the rest of the lifespan. So they're irreparable insults that occur in that life cycle. But then school-age children and adolescents are continuing to grow, but also importantly, their brain is growing enormously and developing tremendously in this life cycle period and requires good nutrition for healthy development. And then a sort of neglected population, I think, in nutrition is the elderly, where there are certain vulnerabilities to malnutrition, vitamin B12 as an example. And as you well know, these are also the individuals who are particularly vulnerable right now to COVID-19. So they need our protection. Okay, so in terms of solutions, these are some of the actors who are really engaged in working on hunger and nutrition security around the world. So at the global level, our group is actually working with the United Nations Committee on Nutrition, World Food Program, UNICEF, WHO, and FAO are UN agencies involved in hunger alleviation. Then you have several NGOs like CARE, Save the Children, CRS, among many others who are also working to ensure that people are getting the food that they need. At the national level, you have government agencies, USDA and FDA. You have non-governmental agencies, Feeding America, Bread for the World, Action Against Hunger, among so many others. And then locally, we have the St. Louis Area Food Bank, Operation Food Search, Catholic Charities. Our group is working with St. Louis Food Angels, which is actually some WashU students who have organized around delivering food to people. And then I wanted to mention also the institutions that are vital in thinking about nutrition security. So as they move forward in providing food in nursing homes and schools and child care facilities, prisons and hospitals, in especially vulnerable populations to COVID-19 as well. There are some programs that are specific to coronavirus. So the CARES Act, I'm sure many of you are familiar with that, Families First Coronavirus Response Act, which unfortunately misses undocumented immigrants. School feeding has continued during this shelter-in-place situation for us. School feeding actually represents the largest public investment in nutrition globally. There was a recent article in the New England Journal of Medicine that says that it's in the US meeting up to 2/3 of nutritional needs. But we can think more creatively about how we do this so we save people time and exposures, such as delivering food for a week or drive-by. There are options that we need to consider to protect people from these communities. And then food aid programming, just the traditional ones that we have had continue to be in operation. Okay, now this is the point that's very important, I think, in terms of a public health message. We need to continue to be ready to protect individuals as new and different emerging infections occur on our planet. Coronavirus is not going to be the last one. They are said to occur in our world every 6 to 12 months. And see, these are some of the examples of infectious diseases that have been classified as emergent infectious disease. So SARS, MERS, Ebola, Zika, chikungunya. Many of you are probably familiar with these. And then there are the re-emerging infectious diseases. So we need to do our level best to make sure that human bodies are healthy and ready for these diseases as these viruses and pathogens and bacteria, parasites that occur and infect us. How do we do that? Well, we can work toward meeting the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2 being end hunger. We can also be very vigilant about meeting the World Health Assembly goals for nutrition, which include reducing stunting, reducing anemia, reducing low birth weight, also childhood overweight and obesity, increasing exclusive breastfeeding, and then reducing childhood wasting. So if we work to meet these UN development goals and these WHA goals, we can be better prepared for infections as they occur, as well as having healthy, nourished populations. So again, coming towards a conclusion, I wanted to mention some of the research that we are working on, not directly related to oranges and tuna, but somewhat. We are working on fish in Kenya. Hold on one second, the cat needs out, just one second.
We're going to be moving to the questions part of the program, so please feel free to begin sharing in chat the questions and comments that you have for Dr. Ayanani.
Okay, so in Haiti, we're working on eggs. Eggs are a good example of very nutritious food that can also be low cost for the nutrients that it delivers. I would recommend any of you working in nutrition programming thinking about that for populations like the elderly, but also infants and young children. Fish as well, like I mentioned, having the zinc, that's very important, but also the fatty acids. And in Ecuador, we're working on this evolutionary diet, so a more holistic approach with a mix of fruits and vegetables and animal source foods. Once again, to conclude, what might I suggest for your grocery bag? And that all depends, of course, on who's in your household and how much of a chef you are, likely, and the things that you want to have in your household. But here's a few. I think it's, of course, important to wear a mask, use hand sanitizer, protect the workers who are in those grocery stores that you're visiting. But think about that food matrix and the dietary mix of foods for immunity and for the vulnerable in your household and in your communities. And then have a healthy, balanced, diverse set of foods. Animal source foods, especially important for children and pregnant lactating women and the elderly. A variety of fruits and vegetables. For inflammation, as I mentioned. Beans, legumes, potatoes, and tubers that store really well over longer periods of time, but also deliver good nutrients. And then try to avoid ultra-processed foods, but indulge here and there. I think, I have my ice cream cone every night. It's important to make sure that you have balance in your diet. And then, of course, don't forget the oranges and the tuna in the grocery bag. So with that, I conclude. And Janet, do you want me to stop sharing the slides and then we...
It's up to you. I would say why not stop sharing the slides. That will bring images of faces larger for folks. Or as we pivot to questions now. So logistically, first, lots of very positive comments about the content. People having a desire to see these slides to reference. Will you be okay with us posting them online? Okay, great. So within a day or two, we'll get these posted on the same website. Everybody registered, and you can, if you want to blow up a screen or just take time to study, you'll have that opportunity. Okay, so our first question from Angela. She was curious what your take on properly cleaning produce is in this moment of the pandemic, how to be safe with groceries.
Yes, so we know that that SARS-CoV-2, the name of the actual virus, is not foodborne, that we're not necessarily ingesting infected, although they are starting to show that there's some susceptibility in the enterocytes. However, it is very important, we'll be lecturing on food safety. It's very important to clean fruits and vegetables because there are other pathogens and other contaminants on those foods that we need to protect ourselves from, especially during this period of vulnerability. So tune in for Angela's lecture for that.
Laura, excuse me, I have a secondary question, and this is in reference to the maps that you were showing. You showed a map by the World Food Program, and you also showed some maps in St. Louis in regards to food deserts and people that didn't have access to food. And the question is in particular about some of the acronyms that were on the map. And there were two acronyms, LA and LI. We're assuming that LA stands for limited access. What does LI stand for?
Oh boy, I am not sure. We might need to share screen again and go back. Was it the world map or was that the
So if Dan can clarify, I think it may have been on the St. Louis maps.
St. Louis map.
Yeah.
In the St. Louis map. Okay, let's go back to that and see. I need to look that up.
Okay.
Oh, that's low. I'm sorry, that's low income. LI is low income.
Perfect, low income.
Limited access is LA. So that's a great question. And now I remember.
So another question coming from Chris. Curious for any commentary from you on school lunch programs and whether they likely do or don't constitute nutritious foods.
Foods are, but generally, yes, I think they do include. Unfortunately, there is some politics around what gets included in school lunches, and that's true locally, regionally, and globally in terms of food industry that might lobby to have their foods as part of the basket. However, I think for the most part, we have worked towards healthy baskets for food. I think that the trouble, at least what I have anecdotally heard, is that there's a need for people to go and get these foods every day. And that's hard for people who maybe don't want to travel every day out and get the foods. That it's much better if we're delivering them for bulk package in pretty easy.
So I have another question, and this is in reference to your work that you're doing in Kenya. One of our attendees, Charles, he works a lot with salmon and talking about that interest for Native people in the Pacific Northwest. And so his question is, what particular fish are being utilized in Kenya? And
Sorry,
are there any...
Lee, could you repeat that? It cut out.
Sure. What kind of fish are being procured in Kenya for this nutrition, and are there any challenges in procuring these fish and for the people in Kenya?
Yeah, that's also a great question. We are looking at nutritional the entire coast of Kenya, and we're seeing almost paradoxically that small I'm not sure if you can, oh, came back. Again, I think I froze for a minute there. But people are selling the fish to earn money as opposed to keeping it in the household, even though it's very nutritious. They are, mostly they consume small fish and sell the larger fish, like snapper as an example. There's emperor fish that we're seeing. But some of the small fish, like sardines and herring, those are actually more nutritious. So we're happy about that, that even though, you know, low-income people are keeping the small fish for the household, that's a good thing because they're more concentrated in nutrients like choline and zinc. And so in Tanzania, for example, there's the fish, the daga, but then again in Kenya, we've got the, you know, again, the herring and the sardines, which are actually really good for people.
Great. A question from Major DeBerry. He's wondering what thoughts or strategies you think might be effective for securing nutritious foods in urban food deserts.
Can you repeat the first part, Janet? It cut out a little bit.
Oh, sorry. So I was just saying this is a question from Major DeBerry, our participant, and he's interested in urban food deserts and strategies to provide nutritious foods there.
Yeah, this is a problem that is that occurs in many cities around the country, and there are ways. Oh, maybe Gene, it looks like he's raising his hand. There are ways that we can motivate or incentivize businesses and grocery stores to develop in those regions, and that's part of the solution from my point of view. We have those their presence in food deserts. There are also small grocery stores. I know Baltimore has some really innovative approaches to using corner stores to produce healthy, or sorry, to provide and have available to people healthy foods. So there's a variety of different ways that we can work to diminish the effects of the food desert in the United States.
Hey, Jenna, we have Laura, we have a question in regards to organic food versus non-organic food. Do you have a particular recommendation, one over the other?
I'm pausing just for a minute because I think I froze, or somebody froze. Yeah, so I think that locally produced foods is what is important in terms of, you know, the environment and minimizing the transportation costs to the environment and to the public. I think that's actually something to pay attention to, even more so than organic. Organic is important, and maybe Angela will get to this in her lecture, in terms of thinking about some of the contaminants. Sorry, I think it froze. It keeps freezing. I'm so sorry. But we need to be very discerning and discriminating when we go to buy organic food. It's not regulated in the same way, so that it may be falsely advertised to be organic. That's something to pay attention to in grocery stores.
So we have a question, and I'm not sure whether this would be within your scope of expertise, about the Undocumented Immigrant Act, and wondering during the pandemic what would be covered for students who are out of status.
Yeah, I'm not sure that I can answer that entirely, Janet. That's something maybe we should get back to that individual about.
Okay. And I see that Gene Kahn is raising his hand. I'm going to see if I can empower him to speak. I'm not certain whether the webinar settings will allow. Jean, I apologize if I can't allow you to speak verbally. And if that becomes the case, please throw your comments into the chat. Let's see if this works.
You can hear me.
Yes, we can hear you now.
That I thought I would give it a try. So hello to all three of you, and Laura, thank you for all of this information. It's really mind-boggling today how much hunger is an issue that's related to the pandemic. I think that we sort of need to look, I'd like you to comment, if you will, on obviously food deserts and the work you do, globally, is one really big, and, we've made incremental progress, but obviously not enough progress, certainly not enough progress for the effort and attention you've given it, Laura. But I think that now we have almost a separate course, because I think that with the advent of this pandemic and potentially it resurfacing again in the fall, and a lot of talk about the idea that in this next decade we could see several pandemics, not only this current coronavirus one, how we might sort of look at preparing so that we aren't faced with the food pantries and the hunger crisis that is part of the pandemic.
Yeah, I completely agree. And this is why our lab works on some of these underlying determinants. So poverty and the economic drivers of malnutrition are so very present. And I think that's part of the solution, is just thinking in terms of, moving people out of poverty so that they're not put into these circumstances of hunger. And I think, to your point, Jean, that, the implications of this outbreak are going to be rippling through our societies for a long time. And the consequences of on our livelihoods, that's going to be far greater in terms of the malnutrition that results and the hunger that results is going to be coming from those economic hits that are occurring from this pandemic. So I spent a lot of time talking about nutrition as it relates to infection in the human body, but it's the economic impacts of this that are going to result in hunger for a long time to come. So we need to continue to invest in getting people out of poverty, and in the meantime, addressing those key nutritional problems that I highlighted: stunting and anemia and low weight and overweight and obesity.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Hey, Laura, I kind of have a comment and a question that is somewhat related. So yeah. Amy mentions that she just received a notification that Food Outreach is providing packed boxes with a month's worth of food to their clients on Wednesdays and Thursdays, and will continue this practice at least until the end of June. And I thought this was a good segue for Miranda's question, which is, she's saying, being aware of the food deserts and low income per zip codes, when speaking with a family who may be worried about where their next meal may come from, how can someone approach them with the concerns and articulate the things that they should be thinking about when it comes to overall nutrition and ultimately immunity from, infection?
Well, first of all, that's great news on the food deliveries once a month, twice a month. That's wonderful. Nice to hear that. And I think in terms of interactions with households who might be feeling the anxiety of not having enough food, I think it's important to, again, talk to people about certain vulnerable members of the household. So if there are young children, if there are pregnant or lactating, if there are elderly in the home, or even if they're school children, these are the especially vulnerable groups that if there are gaps in their nutrition during this period, it's going to have consequences for a long time to come. So I think starting with that as you have those conversations, and then working with people to find healthy, affordable foods and to connect them to different resources within the community. There are these tremendous organizations that are providing food and really doing good work in communities.
So Kitra has a question wondering if any of your research or research that you're familiar with connects food waste by some with food insecurity of others.
Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, when I had the privilege of working with the UN on sustainable development goals with regards to nutrition, food waste was one of the really interesting topics that we were struggling with, which is, that food waste, and in our country, we think of food waste occurring, for example, in restaurants or hotels or food service industry. But food waste around the world actually more often happens in sort of post-harvest losses. So you harvest the food, and actually that's happening right now with COVID-19 as well. And the food gets wasted. It doesn't make it even into any sort of processing or distribution. So we need smart, clever people who can think about ways to more efficiently capture some of that food waste. It's a huge problem. I think something like 1/3 of our food supply is wasted. So it's a very important question.
So one question in relation to nutrients and micronutrients. So if you could just kind of summarize some key takeaways or maybe just some key items that people should be thinking about when they're making day-to-day decisions about their diet. What are some really important focal points to think about?
Well, I mean, again, I want to emphasize it's not, don't overcomplicate things. It's really variety, diversity. I spend a whole lot of my time in research on thinking about just diversifying people's diets. And that's the very best way you can get a variety of micronutrients and macronutrients into your body. Having a variety of healthy foods. So fresh fruits and vegetables, cooked fruits and vegetables, animal source foods, again, very important. But I do think, what is interesting now in terms of infectious disease, there are certain foods that are going to be healthier for protecting against infection. Oranges and tuna as two examples of food groups where, again, you're getting the zinc that you need, or you're getting the vitamin A that you need for mucosal immunity in the respiratory tract. But please don't forget that we don't want to single out nutrients, that they are and should be consumed with one another in these food matrices as the best way to absorb and metabolize.
So a nice follow-on to that, because you had mentioned zinc. And Chris was curious whether you have any thoughts about the efficacy of zinc lozenges to reduce symptoms and severity of COVID, whether you've seen any evidence around that yet.
I have not seen any evidence for that, and I would caution against that. I think I would not dispute, and I think there is evidence. This is why I highlighted zinc. Zinc is really important for T cell immunity. WHO actually recommends zinc for resolving the problem of diarrhea around the world. So when you have ORS, you're also given oral rehydration therapy. You're also given zinc. However, I would very much caution against too much zinc. Minerals especially, we don't eliminate. Going back to that biology of nutrition, we can't get rid of minerals sometimes when they're in. So don't overdo these nutrients, because that could have a harmful effect as opposed to being helpful. I would be very careful with that and opt for the tuna or the fish for your zinc instead of the lozenges.
Well, Laura, are there any final comments or sort of closing remarks that you'd like to offer the group? as we end today's session?
Just want to say thank you to the alumni and to all the practitioners who are actually hard at work feeding people. I get to think about it a lot and you know, aspire to finding interventions that can be played out, but you guys are the ones who are out there doing it, and it's so needed in this time. So thank you for coming and for listening, and it's nice to have this opportunity. Thank you, Janet.
Well, thank you, Laura. This was fantastic, so informative, so timely, and obviously hit questions that people have been holding and wanting to ask an expert, and today you gave them an opportunity. That is what Open Classroom does, and we're so delighted to have you all here with us. I will share with you a program note of what we have coming up on Tuesday. That would be our next Open Classroom, Tuesday, May 12th. Doug Luke from our head of our PhD program in public health is going to be presenting SimCity and Zombies, what they can tell us about pandemics. So for those of you who were on before we got started and we were talking about Fortnite, we bring it all the way back around to video games. But in seriousness, we're so delighted to have you joining us here with Open Classroom. It's a very strange time that we're living, and to bring community together is fantastic, to learn, to share, to raise questions, and to have a chance to ask an expert. So we wish you healthy, safe, and look forward to seeing you at another Open Classroom soon. Take care, everybody. Be well.